Hey y'all, it's Heather here with Underwater Panther, forever working on multiple series at one time. So, this video is called Sovereignty versus Identity Capture: Why Freedom Starts Inside the Mind. So, before we go any further, I want to name the larger context this conversation is sitting inside, because without it, nothing we're talking about here will make sense. What we're witnessing in American politics right now isn't just polarization or ideological conflict. It's something more structural. Politics has begun functioning as a religious container. In periods where traditional institutions lose credibility, like religion, education, media, and community, which I will be breaking down in a moment, people don't stop needing meaning, morality, and belonging. Those needs don't disappear, they migrate. Human beings are not wired to live without moral orientation. We need frameworks that tell us what matters, how to act, who we are in relation to others, and where responsibility lives. When institutions that once provided those frameworks fracture or reveal themselves as misaligned with lived reality, the psychological need they were holding doesn't dissolve. It looks for a new container. This is where migration happens. Meaning moves first. When religion no longer feels trustworthy or coherent, people don't become meaningless. They attach meaning to ideologies, identities, causes, movements, or narratives that promise clarity. Morality follows closely behind. Ethical reasoning, once shaped through embodied practice and community accountability, relocates into abstract systems, slogans, positions, alignment markers. Belonging migrates last, often with the most force. Humans will endure confusion longer than isolation. When community breaks down, people will attach themselves to almost anything that offers inclusion. The danger is not that these needs migrate, that's inevitable. The danger is where they land. When meaning, morality, and belonging migrate into systems not designed to hold them, like politics, platforms, or mass identity movements, those systems become overloaded. They begin performing jobs they were never built for. Politics becomes sacred. Ideology becomes moral law. Identity becomes virtue. Dissent stops being disagreement and starts feeling like heresy. This is how belief replaces thinking at scale. What was once processed through slow, relational, embodied institutions becomes compressed into fast, symbolic ones. Moral judgment speeds up, nuance collapses, emotional intensity gets mistaken for ethical clarity. That is reminding me of that freaking kid on YouTube. Ian Carroll was tearing into him tonight. It was hysterical. I think his name is like Nick something. This kid, I don't know what generation, Gen Z, I'm assuming. I'm a millennial. I'm assuming he's a Gen Z. He's probably younger than I am. He is so freaking emotional and cursing and all over the place. And maybe the younger kids think just because someone is so emotionally intense that equals truth and facts. It certainly doesn't, and don't get that confused, please. So, the more unstable the environment becomes, the more tightly people cling to whatever container is currently holding their sense of self. This is not a failure of character. It is a predictable psychological response to loss of trust and coherence. When institutions fail to integrate reality, people don't become apathetic, they become over attached. They moralize harder, they identify more rigidly, and they seek certainty more aggressively, not because they want control, but because uncertainty without containment feels like a threat. So understanding this changes how we interpret the moment we're in. We're not living through a time of too much belief. We're living through a time of misplaced belief. And until meaning, morality, and belonging are returned to containers that can actually hold complexity, embodied communities, accountable relationships, and integrated inner authority, they will keep migrating into systems that fracture under the weight. That is the pattern, and recognizing it is the first step towards changing it. All right, so now I'm going to break down how religion, education, media, and community broke down. I've been writing a lot about that in my generational series books, actually, and talking about it in the generational series, I should say. But I'm going to recap it here. So these institutions didn't fail at once, and they didn't fail because people suddenly became shallow or immoral. They failed because they stopped integrating lived reality while still demanding authority. Each one broke in a different way, but the pattern is the same. So, number one, religion, loss of moral credibility without loss of moral need. I'm like all over the place. Here's my video. Religion didn't collapse because people stopped needing spirituality, ethics, or meaning. It collapsed because its moral authority fractured. Several things happened simultaneously: exposure of hypocrisy, abuse scandals, financial corruption, and political entanglement. You are seeing that with TPUSA. TPUSA reminds me of COVID. I think it's a huge freaking wake up call. All right, so rigid dogma failed to adapt to changing social realities. Moral certainty was enforced without accountability. And institutional power replaced spiritual embodiment. When religious institutions continued to claim moral authority while violating their own values, trust broke. But the human need religion once held, purpose, coherence, ritual, and conscience did not go away. So morality migrated. People didn't become less moral, they became moral elsewhere. This is why politics, ideology, and identity movements began functioning like religions. They absorbed moral certainty, symbolic language, purity test, and belonging. Religion lost credibility, not relevance. Number two, education, credentialism replaced wisdom. Education broke when it shifted from formation to production. Historically, education served multiple roles: teaching critical thinking, transmitting cultural wisdom, forming ethical judgment, and preparing people for civic life. Over time, those roles were narrowed into standardized testing, credential acquisition, workforce sorting, and debt financed compliance. Education became transactional. Students were taught what to think. Students were taught what to think or what to pass, not how to discern. Curiosity was penalized, complexity was simplified, risk taking was discouraged. Meanwhile, institutions continued to promise security and opportunity, even as those outcomes disappeared. This created a quiet betrayal. People did everything right, followed the rules, trusted the system, and were left unprepared for reality. When education lost its credibility as a truth forming institution, people didn't stop learning, they stopped trusting where learning came from. So people turned to self study, podcasts, long form conversations, alternative frameworks, and decentralized knowledge. Education didn't disappear, authority did. Number three, media narrative replaced truth seeking. Media broke when it stopped functioning as a shared reality coordinator and became an attention economy. Earlier media ecosystems operated on scarcity, required verification, served broad audiences, and synchronized public attention. Modern media operates on outrage and speed, requires emotional certainty, fragments audiences, and monetizes identity and fear. Truth becomes less important than engagement. Complexity lost to narrative, and correction lost to virality. As trust eroded, people didn't stop consuming information, they stopped believing anyone was neutral. This produced hyper skepticism, conspiracy thinking, identity based news consumption, and moralized information streams. Media didn't just fail to inform, it trained reactivity. And when media stopped holding shared reality, individuals were left to construct reality alone, often under emotional pressure. And number four, community. Fragmentation without replacement. Community didn't disappear, it atomized. Several forces converged: economic mobility and instability, suburbanization and isolation, digital replacement of physical presence, work consuming relational time, loss of integrational spaces. Traditional community once provided informal moral correction, relational accountability, shared rituals, and identity without performance. When those structures weakened, people were left with loneliness, dislocation, weak social mirrors, and performative belonging online. Humans cannot self regulate indefinitely without relational containment. So, belonging migrated into phantoms, political tribes, ideological identities, online movements, and parasocial relationships. Community didn't vanish, it became abstract and unstable. So, authority without integration. All four institutions shared the same failure. They continued to claim authority without integrating reality. They stopped listening downward, they stopped adapting, and they protected power instead of trust. When this happens, legitimacy collapses. And when legitimacy collapses, meaning does not disappear, it relocates into whatever structure still offers certainty, belonging, moral clarity, and identity. That's why belief migrated into politics. That's why identity became moralized. That's why disagreement feels existential. That's why people feel unmoored by hyper convicted. This is not decadence, it's displacement. So, the key insight here: people are not irrational for clinging to belief, they are responding to institutional vacuum. The danger isn't belief itself, it's belief without integration, accountability, or embodiment. Until meaning, morality, and belonging are returned to systems capable of holding complexity, embodied communities, internal conscience, relational accountability, they will keep overloading systems that were never meant to carry them. And those systems will keep breaking. That is the pattern, and naming it is the beginning of repair. So, the United States politics has increasingly absorbed the role that religion once held. Moral authority, identity formation, belonging, good versus evil framing, symbolic purity, and promises of salvation or collapse. That doesn't make people irrational or malicious. It makes them human in an environment where the old containers broke before new ones were ready. This entire series exists to explain what happens inside the human mind when that shift occurs. All right, so I'm going to take a drink break and then go over the brief summary of the arc of this video series so far. All right, so brief summary of this series arc so far. In video 1, we named the surface level issue, how belief begins to replace thinking when certainty feels safer than complexity, and how moral judgment erodes when conclusions are defended instead of examined. In video 2, we went deeper and talked about shadow, how unintegrated fear, aggression, and contradiction get projected outward when societies lose their ability to hold complexity internally. That's when morality becomes formative instead of ethical. Performative. Excuse me. In video 3, we moved beneath ideology entirely into moral cognition. How different minds experience truth differently based on how they process values, threat, and meaning. Not because truth is fake, but because cognition mediates how we access it. And in video 4, we contrasted polarization with integration, showing what a mature moral system actually looks like. And that separates morality from, and one that separates morality from identity, restores proportionality, acknowledges shadow, and prioritizes regulation over reactivity. So, if you've been following along, you've probably felt this shift already. This isn't about politics anymore, it's about where moral authority lives. So, this brings us to this conversation because when politics takes on a religious function, something subtle but dangerous happens. Inner authority gets outsourced. People stop asking, "What do I actually think?" and start asking, "What does my side believe?" That shift is called identity capture. All right, so I'm going to have to shift through my notes really quick. All right, so I should have been more organized. I do apologize. All right, so why this video matters, which brings us to this conversation. All right, so let's talk about identity capture. And the alternative to identity capture is not disengagement, apathy, or rebellion, it's sovereignty. So, this video is about naming that difference clearly, calmly, and without moralizing. Not to tell anyone what to believe, not to attack any group, but to restore something that modern culture quietly stripped away: the capacity to hold conscience inside the self. All right, I need a different jam. All right, this is a good one. All right, so transition into the body. This is the body. Because the real crisis isn't that people believe the wrong things, it's that belief has replaced inner authority altogether. And once that happens, no system, political, religious, or cultural, can remain ethical for long. And once that happens, okay, so I already said that. I'm getting exhausted. I'm not going to edit this. It is what it is. So, in this video, we're going to name what sovereignty actually is, how identity capture works psychologically, why it feels moral even when it isn't, and why freedom doesn't begin in institutions. It begins in the mind, not as ideology, as capacity. So, by this point in the series, something fundamental should be clear. The greatest threat to moral clarity today is not ignorance, disagreement, or lack of intelligence, it is capture. More specifically, it is the quiet outsourcing of inner authority to external identity systems. political, religious, cultural, ideological, that promises certainty, safety, and belonging in exchange for discernment. All right, so what sovereignty actually is and isn't. Sovereignty is one of the most misunderstood concepts in modern discourse. It is not rebellion, it is not contrarianism, it is not cynicism, detachment, or independence theater. Sovereignty is the capacity to think, feel, decide, and revise without needing permission from a group identity. It is the ability to participate without dissolving, to belong without surrendering conscience, to engage without being owned. A sovereign person can hold beliefs, a captured person is held by them. This distinction matters more than ideology itself because ideology is only dangerous when it replaces the internal capacity to reflect, revise, and take responsibility. How identity capture actually happens. Identity capture does not begin with manipulation. It begins with relief. Belonging feels safe. Certainty feels stabilizing. Alignment feels like clarity. And in moments of fear, instability, humiliation, or moral injury, the nervous system will choose certainty over discernment every time. This is not weakness, it is biology. Humans are relational beings operating inside stress. When systems collapse, religion, education, media, economic stability, people do not stop needing meaning. They simply transfer that need onto whatever structure remains visible and loud enough to hold it. This is how identity capture works, not through force, but through comfort. The shift that defines capture. Identity capture works slowly, relocating the center of moral gravity. Instead of asking, what do I actually think? What feels true after reflection? What aligns with my lived ethics? The captured mind begins asking, what do we believe? What does my side say? What response keeps me included? At that point, morality stops being an internal process and becomes a performance. You are no longer responsible for ethical reasoning, only for signaling alignment. This is the precise moment sovereignty collapses. Why sovereignty feels so different. Sovereignty is quiet. It does not require constant reinforcement. It does not panic when challenged. It does not collapse under disagreement. A sovereign mind can change without shame. A captured mind experiences change as betrayal. That is the core difference. Captured identities fuse belief with selfhood. Sovereignty keeps belief revisable. This is why identity capture feels righteous, moral, and even sacred, because it hijacks something real, the human need for meaning, belonging, and coherence. But here is the critical truth. No external system can hold conscience for you without deforming it. Not religion, not politics, not culture, not trauma narratives, not being on the right side of history. The moment conscience is outsourced, it atrophies. Participation without possession. Sovereignty does not mean disengagement. A sovereign person can participate deeply in systems without being consumed by them. They can advocate without becoming rigid, belong without surrendering discernment, care without becoming reactive, and commit without losing flexibility. This is not neutrality, this is maturity. Identity capture collapses complexity into loyalty tests. Sovereignty tolerates complexity long enough to act wisely. Captured systems reward certainty. Sovereign systems reward accountability. Captured cultures punish dissent. Sovereign cultures require feedback. Why modern systems discourage sovereignty. Here is the uncomfortable part. Most modern platforms are structurally hostile to sovereignty. Algorithms reward emotional certainty. Outrage increases visibility. Identity signaling increases safety. And nuance reduces reach. Sovereignty slows things down. It asks questions. It refuses instant conclusions. And that makes it expensive in attention economies. So, choosing sovereignty today often means choosing discomfort, being misunderstood, losing social reinforcement, and resisting instant validation. This is why sovereignty feels lonely at first, but it is the only position from which truth can evolve. Fusion versus relationship. So, this distinction matters. Fusion erases boundaries, and relationship requires them. Captured identity is fusion. Sovereignty allows relationship. You do not dissolve into the group, you do not harden against it. You remain intact within it. This is the difference between compliance and participation. A mature moral system requires sovereign individuals. Otherwise, power accumulates in the loudest narratives, not the wisest ones. Why identity capture precedes authoritarianism. Identity capture always comes before authoritarian control. Not because people want domination, but because captured minds cannot self regulate. When internal regulation disappears, external control rushes in to replace it. Rules replace conscience, punishment replaces accountability, force replaces trust. This is not a political failure, it is a psychological one. What sovereignty is built from? Sovereignty is not an attachment or an achievement, excuse me. It is a practice. It is built through pausing before reacting, separating worth from belief, tolerating uncertainty without collapse, integrating shadow instead of projecting it. Don't let me go down that hole right now. Letting ethics live in behavior, not slogans. This work is slow, invisible, and unglamorous. And it is the through line of this entire series. So, in closing, truth. The closing truth. Jesus, sorry, I've been filming for too long. Belief without thinking leads to capture. Thinking without sovereignty leads to paralysis. But sovereignty allows belief to stay alive. The future will not be decided by which identities win. It will be decided by how many people remain internally free while participating in shared systems. This is the quiet revolution. It does not start in institutions. It starts in the mind, the nervous system, and the courage to stay conscious under pressure. So, in the next phase, we'll explore why sovereignty expresses differently across personality structures, archetypes, and moral cognition, because I have to loop back in psychology. And why some minds resist identity capture more naturally than others. Not because they are better, but because they are wired differently. So, where this leaves us. So, if there's one thing I want to leave you with, it is this. The work isn't choosing the right belief. The work is building the capacity to hold complexity without losing your humanity. Belief isn't Belief itself is not dangerous. Identity capture is. When conscience is outsourced to groups, platforms, or narratives, morality becomes fragile. It hardens, it reacts, and eventually it gets used by power, by fear, or by whoever speaks the loudest. Sovereignty isn't rebellion, it is neutrality. It isn't disengagement, it's the ability to participate in shared systems without being owned by them. It's staying internally intact under pressure. It's letting beliefs stay revisable. It's choosing accountability over alignment. And most of all, it's remembering that no external system can carry your conscience for you without deforming it. That doesn't mean withdrawing from the world, it means showing up to it awake. So, in the next video, we're going to look at why sovereignty comes more naturally to some mind than others. And yeah, so don't forget, freedom doesn't start in institutions, it starts in the nervous system, the mind, and the willingness to stay conscious when certainty feels safer. That is the work. All right, so feel free to leave your thoughts and feelings in the comment section below. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next conversation.